Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Morning, everyone. Well, might not be morning. I don't know when you're listening to this, but hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shape the System, and we're going to talk about education today. It's actually a topic we haven't covered a lot on the program, so I'm super excited to dive into it. I've had some pretty strong feelings about where education's at and whether the education we have today is even relevant in the way our society works today and where it's all going. And so I'm super excited to welcome onto the show Shaunak Roy from Yellowdig. And I'm not going to explain what Yellowdig do. I'll absolutely let Shaunak do that. But let's just start by welcoming you to the show and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive straight into education and everything that's wrong with it and what could possibly be right about it.
Yeah, Vincent, so great to be here on the show and happy to discuss everything about education. This is what we live and sleep and breathe all day long. So always excited to talk about what's wrong and also really what's right about education.
Wonderful. Good. So let's, as we always do, start with the problem space. I want to hone in on, I guess, a timeline that I think is accessible to a bunch of us. And I'm 44, adjust for your own age. I'm interested in how the kind of education space has changed in the last 20 or 30 years. And the reason why I'm interested in that timeline is I think the world has changed massively in the last 20 or 30 years. And I kind of want to know where education's at with that. So maybe give us a bit of context as to how the education system works and maybe where that's come from and the evolution of the education system or not over that recent timeline.
Yes, funny that you mentioned you're 44. I'm 44 as well. So we probably have very similar perspectives. I grew up in a country called India. So, it has its own benefits,
sure,
which I can get into, as well as its own hurdles of higher education or primary, secondary higher education. Interestingly, my perspective about education is back in the days, if I go back to my school or early college, it was a lot cheaper. Essentially, it wasn't a big decision in terms of if you get it wrong, it's going to have a devastating, impact on your life, right? So, yeah, if you join a program and if you didn't quite like it, you can switch to something else. Years of tuition is not going to kill you. But fast forward now, I think education, if one thing has changed, is the cost. It has become a lot more expensive. And not only in the US where I live right now, but also in India and many other parts of the world. So the stakes are a lot more higher for us to choose the right kind of education for our kids and for ourselves too, because, a lot more adults are going back to college to get trained on things that they have never learned or probably did not exist 5 to 10 years back. And we know plenty of those things. So that's one big change. The other big change is, I would say, is the internet. 15, 20 years back, right about 20 years back when I went for my undergrad, internet was there, but it was very early. So you had to go to a college to learn about anything. You want to be an engineer, you have to go to a classroom. You have to go to the library. You have to get the books. Today, you have Google, you have YouTube, you have other forums, and you have TEDx Talks. So you can pretty much learn about a lot of stuff without going to college. So it's a lot more accessible, which is a great thing. But it also means that just having access to knowledge doesn't mean you're educated. Education, somebody told me, or I said in one of the podcasts, was education is not the transfer of knowledge, but the transformation of the learner. And back in the days, we used to stay in a campus for 4 years, not so much about transferring or learning about things, but also changing our lives and learning how to be human beings and learning how to solve problems, work with other people, and finally get a job. And that was the life we were living. But unfortunately now, especially with COVID, that kind of a structure has become extremely expensive for a lot of people. And even if you go through that 4-year college degree, it doesn't mean that you're going to get the job that we used to get 20 years back. So there's a lot that has changed in the last 20 years, to say the least.
Yeah, and look, there's probably a couple of things here that I want to just dive into. I think the first one of these is about cost, which is an interesting, it feels like a paradox. If you're in a world where something is more accessible, typically in the traditional kind of classic economic model, it means it must be cheaper. And therefore, because there's more of it and they're just pure supply and demand. What's been driving the cost of a traditional college education? I'm going to use that word broadly, but go there live on campus for 4 years or attend for 4 years. Why has that potentially got so much more expensive? I know it has in the US, but it's surprising to learn that even in places like India, I've certainly experienced it here in Australia or observed it. Do you have a little more intel as to what's actually driving that uplift in cost?
One of the big contributors of cost is the overall experience that students get when they go to a campus. Back in the days, the biggest thing was that you live in a campus, you have some basic services, but you primarily go to class, complete your courses and degrees, and you are graduating. But if you go to a college university today, it's not just a few buildings. Right. They are a lot more than that. You have lazy rivers, you have like almost theme parks in some places, and not everywhere, not in India, but some other parts I've seen. So what has happened, like many other things in the last 20 years, is that I think colleges have become more than just knowledge transfer on places where you just go and attend classes. I think that's number one. And it also has built up more infrastructure. And not everything is by lazy rivers, by the way. You also have labs and many other facilities that you need for active learning, and colleges have invested heavily in that area. And what it means is that it's not just a professor who you had to support 20 years back, but now you have a whole infrastructure that you have to build to be able to provide those services to students. I think the intention behind the cost going up is not that something which is like, hey, just like we're trying to make money. I think there's some good reasons and good intentions behind it, but the net result is that we have a system now which has a huge amount of inertia, a lot of investment behind it, and not necessarily as a result very agile to the current world that we live in. If I'm studying, I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering, and that field hasn't changed for the last 200 years. But not too many engineers want to be mechanical engineers anymore. They want to be engineers which are a lot more advanced. Computer science has become much more popular. Mm-hmm. Even within computer science, you have data science. Now you have artificial intelligence and so many other things. So these things did not exist even 5 years back, let alone 20 years back. So it's not an easy problem for colleges to be a lot more nimble, because the world is changing around them very fast.
Yeah.
So all of that has contributed to the cost, and it also hasn't led to the right solution as a result.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my follow-on questions. It looks like there's been somewhat of an arms race. Everyone's like, hey, we've got a bigger stadium and we've got a larger lab or some offshore area where you can go to Cuba and study there for 6 months, and that feels like a schooling arms race. And then in the world that's evolved in, there's been a question mark as to, well, if the practical skills that I need to be able to be a data scientist are going and learning data science, and that's actually not the best place to learn, or it's maybe not as I can learn equally well that technical capability by getting onto YouTube or going onto Free Code Camp or whatever it is, then the college has a problem, right? Which is, well, why would you come here to do this thing other than maybe the certification that is still in a lot of places recognized? And I'm sure the colleges are leaning on that. So I can kind of see how this juxtaposition's working. And it's just, we're talking a lot about colleges, and I know Yellowdig's quite focused on colleges, but are you seeing this as a kind of a broader issue just in the education system generally, even outside, like down in the US in K-12 or more broadly?
Yeah, colleges, I would say, has the huge amount of impact, because in one end, you have kids who are coming from high school into colleges, hoping to get a job in 4 years. In the other side, you have tectonic shift in technology, tectonic shift in people who are living in different parts of the world. There's a lot of migration that has happened in the last 20 years. You have companies that are looking for drastically new kind of skills. So connecting the dots for colleges is probably the most complicated, but similar challenges also lie in schools. I was looking at some data, like a lot of high schoolers find themselves extremely disengaged because they themselves are also living in a slightly different reality where they feel that college is not as worth it. They hear from their friends and their cousins or family that getting the right kind of jobs, you don't have to go to college, you probably can get the right skills. So there's a lot of confusion right now. And schools themselves are also failing in many ways. A lot of high schools, middle schools are seeing a lot of mental health issues, engagement challenges, and other things. Yeah, I think challenges pretty much kind of pretty broad and wide when it comes to education right now.
There's a lot wrong kind of things.
There's a lot going on. And I think one thing I just want to kind of point here, which is maybe we'll discuss, is that I think the thing about solving this problem is not going to come from the traditional education design. But we have to reimagine education in the current world we are living in. And I do believe technology is going to play a big role in it.
Yeah.
That has an impact in everywhere.
Yeah. And I wanted to get to that because you used this phrase just before, which I think is central to not just what Yellow Dig do, but a big part of the problem. And in some respects, I'm going to take it to the nth degree, some of the disenfranchisement by people around colleges and traditional education structures is this idea of engagement in the classroom. And before we dive into what Yellow Dig does around that, I want to understand that a little bit more. When you look at the mechanics or the data that talks around how engaged are these students and does it reflect how they need to turn up every day and whether that's serving them, let's talk a little bit more about engagement in the classroom from a definitional perspective so we can then dive into how to transform that or invert that, I think is the word you're going to be using.
Yep, no, that's a great question. Engagement in a classroom, traditionally, if you look at a traditional classroom like 10 years back, the rooms that we were sitting in, there were two kind of key data points. One was attendance. So did you really show up for the class?
Right.
And that was one big piece of it. If you're not, you probably will be in trouble. And we always made sure that we are at least showing up for the class, even though you're probably sleeping through or not listening and all sorts of things happen.
So a good story about that in a minute, but yep.
Yeah. So you gotta be in the class. And the second thing is that you gotta pass the test. And the test might happen a week or 2 weeks or maybe 4 months after you attended that class, depending on the structure. So this is how traditionally engagement was measured. And it was okay for back in the days because it was mostly an industrial model. What we were learning was very fixed, primarily basic sciences, basic engineering, accounting, financial things, literacy. We did not have this ChatGPT, which is changing every few months, right? So we were not living in that world. So it was very streamlined, like an industrial operation. Fast forward now, if you look at engage, if you just take those two metrics and measure that, okay, did you attend the class and did you pass, is not going to be indicative whether you're going to be successful by any means. Because what you are teaching is changing and there is an increased need for learners to really make sense of the world now. Because there's so many things that it's in a dynamic system, you can't be fixed. You have to be dynamic too as a learner. And that's the reality of the world today. So today engagement, what does it mean? It means, are you paying attention? Are you proactively participating in the classroom? Are you raising your hand? Are you asking questions? Are you bringing new ideas into the conversation? Are you interacting with your peer group? Because everybody has a different perspective. Getting the perspectives are important. Are you really thinking about designing new things? Are you being creative in terms of applying what you're learning into something new? If I took a class in Python, which is a programming language, just knowing the language is not enough. I need to be able to create something very small so that I know how to apply it. Those things are becoming more important in this world. So that is what engagement is all about. But however, though, if you look at the traditional education, even though it's not always the case, but there's still a big part of higher education is focused on measuring engagement in the old way, which is, did you attend? Did you pass? Naturally, students are not very excited about it because as soon as they graduate, I'm like, okay, what did I learn? How do I get this job? How do I make it happen? My degree or my certificate is not worth it much because I don't have the skills. So all those challenges are coming. So we are defining, and this is where we as a company, we are defining engagement as firstly, deeper learning, which is, are you learning about that subject in a deeper way so that you can apply it or you can make sense of it? And then we are also making it much more peer-to-peer engagement driven because we live in a world where you are knowing one thing is not enough for you to create something. You need to be able to talk to other people and co-construct something. And which is why peer learning is so important in this day and age, which is another dimension we bring into engagement definition. And finally, the final metric we use is that did you finish, which is still the passing part, but did you finish it? Because that's also a huge problem. If in the US, in traditional higher education, I think for a 4-year college, only about 60%, maybe the number is 65 right now, of the students finish in 6 years after starting their course. So there's a big portion of students who are not even finishing. That's a huge problem, which is also we are starting to impact.
Yeah, I think I have some data points on that, which I want to dive into. There's something interesting that the parallel for me here, if you think about education as, I guess, a structure that enables people to move meaningfully into the workforce. I'm being trite in saying that, but realistically in most modes of study, that's ultimately what we're doing. We're trying to teach people to go into professions. If those professions are no longer about hey, you have a very deep knowledge in a particular topic because you're going to be a doctor, for example. And it's more, hey, you need to know how to operate in a world that is changing every 3 years, to use your ChatGPT reference. And so what we're having to do is teach you a bunch of skills. And why wouldn't we deploy technologies that would enable us to understand how the learning is happening along the way rather than just at the bookends? Like I'm thinking about if you worked in a job and the only thing they did to measure your engagement and output and productivity and success in that job was to see whether you turned up every day and then to give you a grade on the day you quit. Like it would be the silliest way to run a company and engage employees. You're like, do you want to be here? Are you meaningfully doing the work? Are you learning as you go? Are there the related skills related to the topic being learned, not just the topic itself? So it's like education needs to catch up with the way we're starting to tackle engagement in the workforce rather than simply be this bookend that happens before you then go into the workforce not knowing how to actually engage. Does that parallel, have you guys observed that parallel as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you made a really good point there, which is if you say that we are living in this world of ChatGPT, what it means is that having individual skills is just not enough.
Right.
Back in the days, I could get a job out of college if I knew how to run Excel or how to do a very basic financial analysis or financial accounting. In the next couple of years, AI is going to do most of it. Right. So a lot of accountants who would go and check books, if you upload all those books online and have algorithms go check everything, you would probably have a much better results in that kind of thing. And which is one example that hasn't happened. It might happen in the next 2 years, but there are plenty of examples of like that. So the idea that you can just go to a school and pick up a few skills and get really good at it, just those 2 skills and know how to do it, very likely you're going to get replaced by AI or some other system in the next 2-3 years. So it's not a good investment anyhow, even if you find a job. You probably will get replaced in the next 5-10 years. The key becomes is not just knowing the skills. I know there is also a lot of talk about skill-based learning, which is good, but sometimes we have to really look at the nuances, what we mean by skills. But the ability to apply skills into a real-world environment and be able to be creative and be able to be analytical and solve problems is the skill that we need to build. And those are the people who are being successful in the workforce because those are the ones who are creating ChatGPT as opposed to being replaced by them. So we need to be rethinking that too, as you said, right? Rethinking how education should change based on what we are actually, the kind of work we are doing. And higher education and the way we solve that problem cannot be the old way, which is not building more classrooms.
Right.
Let's build a ChatGPT 3 classroom, then ChatGPT 4 classroom is not the solution.
It's changed the nature of learning.
Exactly, to be able to create ChatGPT 3 and 4.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, just the one thing I wanted to add on to that, which I'm out of my depth here, obviously, but that's the whole point. It seems to me also, and I think about the example where they talked about Watson, which is IBM's AI thing, whatever you want to call it. They didn't set out to replace doctors. They said, we want to build a different type of doctor who leverages this technology to be a better physician. And I think in a lot of cases, the world that students who are in higher education are going into is one where they need to work out how to be part of a larger organism rather than go in and do their task. You don't go in and be a surgeon anymore. You have to know how to work with the machine and a broader group of people to be able to execute that. And I think the challenge of that environment, whether you're being a doctor or a physician or a lawyer or whatever it is, or building Excel to your example, the nature of the work is that you actually need to know how to work in a fluid, unpredictable and changing kind of environment. And that's the nature of work and thus the nature of learning that you're going into. Is that's definitely part of it too, by the sound of it.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's a really great way of putting it, which is being able to know how to use technology. I recently read, I don't know where I read it, but people said it's not artificial intelligence, it's augmented intelligence. That might be a better term of AI because AI is not, there's a lot of hysteria around AI replacing human intelligence, which is always complicated. It could happen one day, but it's going to take a long time, probably, hopefully.
Yeah.
But AI is probably the most immediate impact is the augmentation of the human capabilities, but it doesn't happen naturally, right? One need to know how to use it.
Yeah.
It's almost like a tool. So be able to learn how to learn and how to critically think about things and connect the dots across domains is getting more important. I do believe one thing that a lot of education we have spent in specializations where people have increasingly specialized in areas and then sub-areas and then sub-areas to really be the expert, the best in the world in that area. But the reality is that sub-area could be the first to be replaced by AI because that's so well defined, you can actually automate that. So I think there's going to be, and this is pure my speculation at this point, is that a move towards generalization where you are actually specializing in connecting the dots across domains.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And probably is going hopefully a big part of education that we're designing.
Yeah, and I kind of want to use that as a segue here to understand how Yellowdig shows up in the classroom. Like the reality, like my limited knowledge of time of pulling technology into the classroom to understand and change the nature of learning is from the annals of history around Khan Academy. And so I don't want to start there, but I kind of want to understand for a student who is operating in the classroom with Yellowdig, what's happening differently to what was happening before or that wasn't even happening before.
Yeah, no. So in terms of Yellowdig, if I could take a step back, the way we are trying to solve the problem is by creating a digital infrastructure which replicates the physical campus. The idea here is that physical campuses are very expensive and increasingly inaccessible to a lot of people for a variety of reasons, because you need more flexibility. You cannot be on campus, on the classroom. So Yellowdig is creating the digital infrastructure so that your access to your knowledge, if you're part of an institution, is from anywhere at any time, so that you're not really constrained by any physicality or any kind of time limitation. So that's the first thing, how we're thinking about education. The second thing is Yellowdig has 3 solutions as a company. So there are, the one that we are talking about is called, what we call it, Yellowdig Engage, which is essentially creating an engaged classroom environment. That's one product. Then we have 2 other products. One is called Yellowdig Connect, which is essentially creating a campus community as soon as you would join any program. So in the past, you would show up in some campus area, there will be a bunch of programming, so you get to know people, but now you can do everything online. So that's the Connect platform that we have. And then finally, Yellowdig Succeed is what essentially connects work, our education with work, where we are trying to create environments where you can get mentors by alumni of your institutions, by other people who are experts in that area, so that you're always interacting with them, who have been invited into that environment by the institution, so that you have more connectivity with work. So that's the overall landscape for Yellowdig. When it comes to classroom, what we try to do is to focus on the teaching part of online education versus the content delivery. If you look at Google, YouTube, Khan Academy, and there are many other sources which are increasingly providing high quality content. Some of that content will be created by educators themselves. Educators can create a video which is really good, high quality, and share with the students. Our focus in the platform is to create the engagement around that content. And from a nuts and bolts standpoint, what essentially happens is when you're using our platform in a classroom, you are talking to your peer group, you're asking questions, you're doing simulations, you are bringing in ideas, you're interacting with your teachers at any time, and you're also connecting the dots in terms of what you're studying in the class, in terms of content that is being shared by the instructor or others with your real life, so that you're bringing your examples. Let's say you're working in a shop floor and you're taking a mechanical engineering course. You may pose a problem saying that, hey, I'm having this problem in my shop floor. I learned this thing and this is what kind of the interesting moment for me. And I shared that in Yellowdig so that others in your class who are learning the same subject can actually chime in or get some key insights out of it. That's one example. We create that environment for the learners to actually engage in a deeper way around that content. So what we are trying to disrupt is this old model I was just explaining, which is come, show up for a classroom, watch a video or watch your teacher and write an exam and you're out.
Right.
To a model where you come to a classroom, get to know your peer group, understand the topic that you're trying to learn, try to connect the topic to everything that's available to you, and have a vibrant conversation.
Yeah.
So that you're learning through conversations. And then the grading part is primarily automated in our platform. So that what your final grade is not something that your teacher gives you at the end of the class. You actually keep on earning your grade based on your participation, based on feedback that you get from your peer group. And at the end, your instructor can say that all that is great, plus you get this because you did something amazing.
Interesting.
So it's a little more dynamic grading in our platform.
Yeah. One of the disadvantages of being an audio show is we can't visualize it, but I want you to just describe it in visual terms, because my imagination, if someone said, how would you describe this visually? I would imagine that you're almost taking a parallel that all of these people are aware of, which is social feeds and the like, and saying there's a whole bunch of stuff that you learn and that content's been delivered. And what we're doing is augmenting that digital content with a whole bunch of a social layer, for want of a better word, that lets the student interact with it by liking it, asking questions, adding their own commentary, engaging with other people's commentary. Is that kind of how that shows up for the student?
Yeah, no, that was a really good analogy. Yeah, exactly right. So, which is, we explain sometimes Yellow Dig is like a social learning environment, like Facebook or LinkedIn or any other platform that you're used to.
Yeah.
The only difference is that it's a feed where all the discussion is happening in one place, but the way the students show up in that feed or the instructor shows up in the feed is designed to drive better quality. As opposed to if you go to Facebook, I often joke about Facebook is not a social platform, right? It's an advertisement platform.
Sure.
So you are there, but you're really not building connections. You're actually trying to click on ads. That's how it's all designed. But what we have taken is that, okay, let's take the same philosophy of a feed, but now the design is to try to drive better engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the point I guess I was making is that a lot of what the challenge is when you try to introduce new models of anything is behavioral change and getting people to do new things. And there's that wonderful example of if you want to turn off a Windows machine, you click on the start button and then click turn it off. Like it's completely counterintuitive. But because everyone knows that's how you do it, a lot of people have followed that pattern because they don't have to teach people that you go to the start button, then find the log out button. And that's considered normal, even though it's completely counterintuitively if you rationalize it. And I think there's a similar thing happening here, which is if someone says, well, I'm already in these networks and they're used in totally different environments and contexts, but I'm used to this behavioral mode where I can go in, I can see content, I can like it, comment it, share, I can add my own experience onto it. And really, ultimately, there's a level of curation that says we're only talking about mechanical engineering. Please don't put your political post on here or whatever else it is that you might do. When you've got students who like kind of want to know the before and the after picture here, you've got a student who doesn't have this at all, and then you've got a student or even a classroom that has it. What does that look like for the students? Are they in there every day? Like, what's the level of engagement that you actually see in this stuff?
They're in the platform at least 3 to 4 times a week.
Right.
On an average. Without Yellow Dig, they will probably come. If there's a discussion board, they might come in once a week to post the discussion and they're done. They won't probably read anything else. In Yellow Dig, we try to get them in as much as possible and we create incentives for them to come in. So we have a point system that drives certain kind of behavior in the platform for the students to come in more often. And the other part of the experience is the following, which is this kind of an engaged, conversation-oriented learning is not also natural for a lot of students. A lot of high schoolers who have been trained in our traditional education system comes with this idea that learning is actually sitting in a classroom, listening to a lecture and not probably paying attention sometimes and then get by it, right? And a huge majority of students just get by the system, which eventually is a problem because if they do that, they won't value why would then there's a big price tag to it. Like, why would I not get much out of it and then pay a huge amount of tuition? Eventually somebody has to.
Something has to give, right?
Yeah, something has to give. So what we find in Yellow Dig is often students will say that, why do I have to do this now? What's my benefit? Why would I have to talk to other people suddenly and actually discuss? And we'll say that, you know what, you will probably, if you do it for a little while, you'll see the value.
Interesting.
And we actually created a video on that,
which is in the
show the students. Yeah, exactly. So that like, why would I have to do this thing now? Like, why is it not just click some buttons and get done with it? And we hear that. We hear from our students. They write to us and they say, you know what, I was not quite sure if this is going to be helpful. It's going to be a waste of time. But now I like it because I get to hear from my other peers, what they're thinking. So it's a transformation. It's not just a tool, but it's also the way we think about education. And that's what we are after.
Yeah, it's fascinating for me on so many levels. The first level, obviously, is this idea that there's a bunch of stuff that the Instagram generation learned. I don't mean the people who founded it, where they learned about how to use irrational behavior and UX patterns and dark patterns to a degree to drive a whole set of behaviors that were borderline addictive to the end of selling advertising and has ultimately been shown by Nir Eyal and the others to be probably counterproductive to what we want as a society. And to hijack those learnings, if you like, and apply them to something that we want economically as a society, and I don't mean that in the money sense, I mean in the allocation of resources sense, but also what most people want for themselves. If you said to someone, hey, I'm going to give you a platform or a way of wrapping something around your education that will make you more engaged and smarter and better able to enter the workforce and probably even enjoy the material more, people will be like, cool, what do I have to do? You just do what you do ordinarily, which is read stuff, watch stuff, click on stuff, engage with stuff, debate stuff. Like, literally that's what you're doing on social media anyway. Like that's fascinating to me. I think the other part of this that is interesting is I wouldn't have thought that it would have been challenging to convince a bunch of people at a certain age group, primarily, I know there's later stage people, to get onto another platform that is going to both increase their grades but also make the platform or make the experience more enjoyable. Yeah, I'm curious about why there's that kind of dissonance there. Do you know more about that?
Yeah, no, I think in terms of any new behavior kind of takes a little bit of effort, even though like there are two pieces of things. One is that how do you get them to use a platform? Your example for Microsoft was great because 2 clicks is probably good enough to get them into a platform, right? More than 2, they won't probably do it. That's why we have 1 click sign up. So you can sign up to Yellowdeck from your school system with 1 click so that we'll put you into the community, we'll put you with your peer group so that you can start to see some value right away. But then the second question is that why do I have to come back every week and start talking to my peer group about whatever I'm doing in my life, right? Let's say I'm taking a course in organic chemistry and all I have to do is to remember and memorize a few equations to pass. Now, suddenly I'm talking about, there's a real example in one of our communities, students are talking about apple juice.
Right.
They're saying that what is apple juice made of? And then they're really having conversations about it. And somebody will say that, oh, I saw this thing and this is what this is made of. So what's really going on here is that you're actually expanding your horizons of what you're trying to learn, from organic chemistry to examples to how it relates to your real life to examples that you're seeing. All of that might seem like more work for you. If you're used to a system where you just memorize and you write an answer, right, and you're unhappy with it, by the way. Right. You get a grade, but you know that probably is not very much worth it.
Sure.
So we really have to convince people. And the only way to convince them is for them to give the experience, which is what we did, by the way. When we launched Yellowdeck Engage back in 2019, we gave the platform for free for about a year almost to instructors, because we had to convince instructors too to use it.
Yeah.
And when they used it and they saw that, okay, this is a better way of learning, and then we started to get traction after that. So it is a lot of work. This is one of the fun part of building a company in education, is that it is like there are multiple layers of problem solving that needs to happen for it to really work.
Well, I was actually going to kind of follow that on with, because we haven't talked much about the instructors or even the colleges or schools themselves. What's the nature of the way you get into the classroom? And I'm focused on the Engage aspect. I know that there's a broader stack, but my guess is that you start with Engage, but prove me wrong. How did that actually, what's the pathway by which you approach or get approached by a college and then actually end up in a classroom in a wholesale way and start having the impact that you're ultimately looking to have, which I also want to understand?
Yeah, the most common way for us to get into a new institution or a new department or a new classroom, which could be any 3 of them, is by a reference, which is a professor in one school having a good experience with us would talk about it or maybe refer to one of their friends. And that's how we have seen work out in education. And sometimes what will happen is we had a conference, we had a great conversation with a professor and they really like the concept and will say, okay, I will sign up and I'll give it a try. So the first step is always convincing them of the value and they at least feeling comfortable enough to try it once. And once they try once, then only we see the real conversion happen for them to becoming more interested in what we are doing. And yeah, from a professor standpoint or instructor standpoint, the big change there is just being comfortable and letting it go with technology. Imagine you're teaching, if you take the example of organic chemistry, all you had to do in the past was come, give a lecture, give an assignment, grade the assignments, and you're done at the end of the course. Maybe you'll have a discussion board, right? Now you're saying that, oh, I have this space for my class where we would like you to engage and bring in examples as a student and share with one another. And I'll be in that community and I'm going to drive that engagement as well as needed. It's not a lot of work for instructors. We actually reduce the work for them through a variety of tooling, but it is a new thing. For them. A lot of teachers, especially ones who are passionate about teaching, really get it intuitively because they try to do that in the classroom.
Right.
So they see that, okay, maybe there's an online environment. So that is one way for them to get excited about it. But a lot of instructors will probably question it, will see that, oh, this might be too much of work. I'm not sure. Maybe they may waste time like Facebook. right? The situation where you were talking about organic chemistry and something else.
There, wouldn't it? Surely.
That's right. Maybe I'll completely. But the reality is that that's where technology comes in. That's where we have designed the system in a way, which is it drives that engagement. So yeah, it takes a little bit of convincing and then slowly. But the good news for us is once they convert into our side, they stick with us. We rarely see instructors going back to the other side.
Yeah. Part of me intuitively thinks that that you kind of need to start with awareness. Hey, does this thing even exist? Then move to kind of desire. This exists and I kind of like this. And then there's kind of a bit of a knowledge gap of I have to be some form of community manager. And I might not need to just put a lot of time into it, but I need to understand the basics of community. And I think David Spinks talks about this a fair bit in his book, The Business of Belonging, I think it is. But community starts with identity, right? And identity is we're all this thing. And in this particular case, is we're all taking this organic chemistry class. We all have an identity that we share. And now what are we doing? Okay, we're facilitating a bunch of interactions and behaviors between these people that is focused on whatever that identity is. And I think that technically and somewhat academically is relatively easy to understand. But in practice, being a good community manager is a learned skill like anything else. And I think fascinating that someone comes to a conference, sees a thing and says, I love the sound of that outcome. And now how do I do it? Oh, well, you kind of need to learn a few new skills and maybe adjust some of the behaviors or add some behaviors you don't have. It's not more work in the overall sense of the word because you'll give up work on the other side, but you do need to take a step forward. And just on the outcome side of it, when you've got a cohort of students who have been using Yellow Dig, and I mean it's been they're fully using it and the professor's got the training wheels off, for example. What is the impact that you see in terms of not just engagement, potentially even getting into the work? What happens post Yellow Dig?
Yeah, no, I think as we spend more time in this space, we will get more data because for that to happen, we need to at least 5-7 years of data to track a student to see how they're performing. So we are starting to collect some of that data, but I would say the most immediate data we hear from them is they tell us that they find it a lot more interesting to hear points of views from their fellow students. That's the first thing we hear from them. Because very often it's like everybody has their own point of view, but when you hear from 5 different points of views, it's interesting because you start to create a map or a picture around it. It becomes a lot more applicable, whatever subject you're learning by applying it, not physically, but mentally. You're applying it to essentially different things. I think based on all the data that we get from people is that it's training students to be better prepared for the real world. How exactly it pans out, of course, we have to see over time. Hopefully the data will show up. They're getting better jobs. They're getting more creative in the jobs or becoming more successful in their jobs. Hopefully some of the data is going to come up eventually.
Yeah, I think you always start with the leading indicators, right? And your job number one for the Engage product is to solve engagement in the classroom. So you can see it by previously none of this engagement was happening at all, or if it was happening offline, we're unaware of it and it was anecdotal as to how much of it was happening. And as it exists today, we can measure it, we can observe how much it's, and we can even talk to the students. And like, what's the typical feedback from a student who's going through a fully embedded Yellow Dig experience?
Yeah, we have done surveys where we poll them every week since they started using it. And we have also an NPS code in the platform, which will prompt them to give their feedback. And the interesting thing is, there are two things we hear from them. One is that very often it's like I was sharing, like I did not quite understand how it's going to help me. But when I got into it, I saw the value of having a network.
Right.
This is something interesting, by the way. Like a lot of people, we ourselves included, if you're in a community group of people, sometimes we may underestimate the value of being in a community. Because we don't know, we don't know anybody. We haven't really created any conversation with them. So we think that, okay, you know what, I can just get my work done and I'm done with it. I don't have to really talk to anybody. But the value of talking to everybody in a low stakes environment where you feel comfortable and open is quite high. And that's what we hear from our students. And hey, you know what, I'm excited to talk to I get to know them a little bit. And things have happened. Like people have found their roommates. They tell us through Yellow Dig, I like this person enough so that, we kind of share the room now.
I like their opinion on organic chemistry enough to move in with them.
Well, I can tell you, that's a very interesting question, by the way. I think that, and I'm willing to bet this, which is in social media broadly, we are not connecting intellectually enough. What ends up happening is that people are pretending to connect with one another because you post a nice picture, you'll say, oh, there are 10 likes because, you like the picture, right? Sure. It's a nice family picture. People like it. But when you're vulnerable and when you're really talking about some deeper subject deeply and you're truly trying to engage in an intellectual point of view, and if you find somebody else who is equally intellectually and you really see that you think the same way, is a great connection, honestly. And I feel that, and those things happen in education. We know that it happens when you're doing a deep project, like a hard project, and you can really create those bonds. And that does happen. I'm saying, I don't know whether people are getting married in Yellow Rig yet. We'll see that if that happens.
Well, that's, again, you've got a leading indicator if they move in together. Do you know what's interesting there? I've got a couple of one question, but also one kind of observation. I'm reminded a little bit, and it's the classic Hollywood frat trope of the study group where they go off and sit in the library for 8 hours. And yeah, they're studying, but they're also socializing. And a lot of what made sort of Facebook, to use the example we've pulled out a couple of times, successful early on was that they didn't invent a new behavior. They said, we've found a way to digitize a behavior that previously existed and make it faster and easier and more accessible and more successful, however you want to define that. And in some respects, study groups are kind of a really kind of offline approach that has a lot of manual steps to it and a lot of kind of organization. And if you could turn that into something that was more asynchronous and digital and accessible, people would do more of it and get a lot of the benefit from it. So I think that's probably my observation. My kind of question, though, is where you have dialogue about a topic, is there a risk that the factual basis of the topic can be either watered down or challenged, and there's a role there for the professor or even for the students to make sure that we're not like missing the wood for the trees on this is actually factually incorrect, or like what happens there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And one of the things I like to say is that if somebody, let's say a student has a factually incorrect perception of something, if they don't share it, if they don't talk about it, there's no way to know they have that. And unless they are actually starting to interact with somebody else who has a factually correct way of looking at it, they're not going to learn. It's all going to be. So if you see the current system sometimes, there's so much focus on getting it right. Write the exam, get an A. That's your goal. And it's a very narrow way of looking at it. But now in Yellow Rig, you're having a lot more conversation in a lot of things. And naturally, there are going to be some things that we're going to say that is probably factually incorrect. So the basic thing we like to say is that that's great. Now that's out there. Now there is a learning moment for them. And then the second thing what happens is that you can now start discussing around it. Just because somebody said something that it seems like factually incorrect, but when they start explaining it, you may see that, you know what, I was wrong and they are actually right. So these kind of light bulb moments happen, and it happens in real life. Have a deep conversation for 1 hour with somebody. You start to really uncover some of the things that you thought is wrong and right, and you start to change your mind.
Yeah, and it's more nuanced than you understood, right?
Exactly. And that's what learning is. Learning can be very nuanced. The same fact could be correct in one environment, but slightly different, looked in a different way, maybe incorrect, right? There could be examples like that. So that's why we don't spend too much time around making it factually right. We say that come in, share information, share knowledge with one another. But we give some tooling to the instructors to drive the conversation in certain ways. Like, for example, we have something called accolades in the platform, where you can have, and the instructor creates, there's a group of accolades, which is default. You already create that, but the instructor can create their own accolades. One of the very popular accolades is that it's a verified response. So let's say somebody asks a question and there are 10 answers. Somebody said a really good answer. The instructor can go and say that this is a verified response. Means that's the right answer. So everybody gets to know that, and better part, didn't come from the instructor, it came from a student, right?
And they get some points or whatever, I'm assuming as well.
They get points for that. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think which is where we don't do grading in our platform. What we don't do is that you share something, you get a 9 out of 10. We don't do that in the platform, but you can get accolades. You can get peer points, peer review points. You can get points taken away if you say something completely inappropriate. Those things also are in the platform so that it's manageable if something happens. But vast majority, we see that students are being very respectful. They're always trying to be helpful. And it's again a human nature. If you're in a study group, how often you're going to be really behaving badly? You're trying to be behaving in your best self. That's a natural thing, right? So
well, also your identity is attached to it. You still have to show up to college or be around these people at some point, presumably. So
exactly.
I've probably got one last question, and I hinted at it before we spoke on the show, and it relates to education. Is like such a broad industry and it's everywhere, right? It's one of the biggest kind of categories in any GDP if you look at pretty much any knowledge-based or service-based economy. So it's absolutely huge. Your focus right now is pretty specifically on kind of US colleges, as I understand it. That's right. I kind of want to just understand where you're up to in your kind of adoption curve through the universities? And then how do you think more broadly about education? Is this kind of just a multi-100-year vision to basically transform education generally? And how do you get along that path? I know it's a huge question, but I need to know where you're at in the curve.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We are primarily in North America right now. We work with over 150 universities here, but we do have partners in other parts of the world. We have in Canada, in Australia, in Singapore, in India. We are doing some work there as well. So we are starting to expand outside the US selectively. And our mission is to go global. For sure, we are a technology company. Why not? But we also want to be measured in how we do it, because just making the platform available to a school won't make them successful. They need to be able to use it properly and make sure that they are seeing the results that they want to see. So yeah, it's a gradual growth for us, but we definitely have plenty of fishes to fry. Just in the US alone, there are 4,000 institutions. So for us we can be very busy just in the US itself.
Sure.
And in also K-12, by the way, one of the interesting things we saw in the pandemic is some of the instructors who were teaching in higher education, they were also teaching in K-12. They were in a school of education, and so that's how they took the platform to K-12. And we have schools that are using us now as well, very successfully, actually. Definitely sometime down the line, we probably might get into K-12 as well. We have corporate training customers too. One of our partners, their chief learning officer became the chief learning officer in a big healthcare company in the US. And one of the first things he did was to bring our platform into their institution to train their employees and their nurses. They have thousands of nurses who are providing healthcare to in-home elderly populations. So they're using our platform to create a group and kind of make sure that they're learning together.
Yeah.
So the things that it's a kind of a space for us. It's kind of emerging as we move forward. So we will follow the market cues to kind of expand.
Yeah, you're going to be busy for a while. It would be remiss of me not to ask where the name comes from before we finish up. So maybe let me know that.
That's a name that is, when we gave the name, we had a vague idea what the product is going to be. And then of course, but there's a meaning behind it. The meaning is yellow dig. So the color yellow means cheerfulness and fun. Every color has a color psychology, and yellow is a very bright color, very cheerful color. And that's what we want to bring to education. I believe that we will do a lot more service to this space if we can make learning a lot more cheerful and fun and engaging.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't expect that. But then the dig part?
And the dig is to dig together. So always learn as a community. Dig together, dig in as a community, do your collective knowledge. And just don't learn on your own. Be together and talk to other people.
That makes a whole lot more sense now. Amazing. Well, Shanak, it was really great talking to you, and we've covered a lot, and obviously there is a lot to cover when it comes to education. As I said, I'm really excited for what you guys are doing. I just think the opportunity just to improve outcomes in the US education system alone is a Herculean task. You've work cut out for you there, but the idea that you could take all these principles and apply them to any form of learning, especially in a knowledge age, is just phenomenal in terms of its aspects. So yeah, I'm stoked for you guys. Hopefully you land the next couple of years and then that trajectory goes in whatever direction it needs to. But thank you again for coming on the show today and talking to us about it.
No, thank you so much, Vincent. Truly enjoyed the conversation. Great to be here. And hopefully this was helpful for your audience.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.